All right, before bringing Mr. Kelvin Emmanuel to discuss Tinubunomics, let's bring you up to speed with what you've been saying on the, let's call it the front pages of the social media. Well, the big one has to do with that NYSC lady, Ms. Rita O'Shea. You know, she had criticized President Tinubu's government at some point about the hardship she's not experiencing as a young person because of the impact of the policies of government. And she went viral that moment, and a lot of people rallied around her. Well, we understand that NYSC, or service to the nation, has been extended by 2 months. The allegation is to the effect that this is because she criticized the president. Well, I haven't seen the official statement from the NYSC, but that is what is all over the social media, that she criticized the president. That's why our service here was extended by 2 months. And if that's the case, then there's a lot of work to be done. So let me just read what people are saying. I know that Omoyele Sowore, the presidential candidate of the AAC, has also said this is not going to be acceptable. He's going to mobilize the NYSC, and she must pass out like other of our colleagues. So the NYSC has to come out clean. We'll be able to find out exactly what the position is. But the speculation, the allegation is to the effect that because she spoke against the policies of government, and that's why her service is extended. Well, Gerald, graphics designer, said this is nothing but political punishment maxed as protocol. So because she spoke up against economic hardship everyone is feeling, NYSC suddenly finds a reason to extend her service here. Shameful. Intimidation tactics won't silence the truth, if any. It amplifies it. No Rita, Ray, no POP. A personal parade, that's what it means actually. So they say it's protocol that you're not supposed to, just like a civil servant, you're not supposed to speak against the government. Does that follow? To what extent, the latitude of that law, how far does it go? Does it take away the fundamental human rights as granted in our grown norm, the Constitution? That's a different kettle of fish. Bukola, you have the
And I'm just wondering, Jeffrey, is it, you know, a strategy or an attempt to stifle expression, you know, henceforth, going forward, even after Rita leaves service, such that any other youth service coming after this will not be able to kick against the oppressive policies of the government as it impacts on members of the youth service? These are things that we should reflect on. Are Nigerians any better after what is being termed as the bold economic reforms of the administration? Petrol is now selling for 935 naira per litre in Lagos. And you know the ricochet effect that that has on the economy. So these are critical issues. Extending her service here doesn't reduce, you know, for any moment or by any shred of the imagination, the reality that is on ground. Exactly. And we must continue to drive home that point, that the reforms, bold as they are impacting very negatively on Nigerians.
You have the next one, Bukola.
So I have the next one, which is from Igbokwe Namdi, who says, we have freedom of speech in Nigeria, but freedom after the speech is not guaranteed. Reminds me of a former Ugandan president. Rescue as that's
it, rescue call.
That's another one. You have it, Jeffrey.
She made her point already. Whatever is the consequence, does it really matter? Enjoy the 2 months. It's not 2 years. Well, I don't know where this person stands on this, but as a matter of fact, this is how I look at it, Bukola. Whatever law there is inferior to the ground norm. Whatever law, I'm going to say that again, to the extent of inconsistency, becomes void. Whatever law there is, I know there are policies that guide organizations like ours, there are policies that guide us here, there are policies that guide the NYSC. That's why I said, to what extent does the policy stop someone from speaking against the policies of government? Because if it is misinterpreted, this is going to be looked as gagging, and this is not good for freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Our ground norm gives us that freedom of expression. Did she insult the president? I can't remember what she said. Did she insult the president? Did she say anything derogatory? Wasn't she speaking about impact of the policy of government on her? So the lawyers will be able to help us as to, this is NYSC rule as against the Constitution of the Federal Republic that is superior to the NYSC rule. So, well, the legalese is all around this as well, but some people have taken it upon themselves that we don't care what the NYSC is thinking. As far as we are concerned, there's freedom of expression. This girl has spoken her voice. You must not. And again, sometimes because of optics, the agencies of government and institutions must be sensitive. So whether or not they are right to punish her, let's even accept without conceding, because of the bad optics sometimes, which the perception of hostility against dissenting voice, you use your discretion. Even the law court does it. Even the Supreme Court can look at the situation, and because that's what it's called the Court of Public Policy. If something is going to bring the country down, then you have to think through before you begin to look at, you know, some of these things. So anyway.
As you have said, I believe that her lawyers, if she's taking this up in the law courts, will interpret what the rule in the core says as against what the Constitution says.
The core is just an establishment, an act that is inferior to the Constitution. So the lawyers will be able to marry what is where. But she's a young girl. Let's not put her through this hell and warm water. It's not necessary. But
there's more on what Nigerians are saying on the front pages.
We'll hold on to what the Nigerians are saying. And then bring in our guest, Kelvin Emmanuel, is already with us in our Abuja studios. Mr. Kelvin, thank you so much for coming through, as always. Let's look at the economy. Good morning, Mr. Kelvin, first up.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me, Geoff and Bukola.
All right.
It's always a privilege to be here.
Fantastic, fantastic, Mr. Kelvin. So we're not going to drag you into legalese. You're not a lawyer on the NYC matter. Let's stay with the issues around the economy, which is your core expertise. I would like to begin with, there are so many things in my head to ask, but let's begin with your general assessment. There's been some gains. Some people have been burnt as a result of these gains. Now we're seeing the interplay of geopolitics, what is happening between Iran and the US and what is happening in that area. Strait of Hormuz that is affected, oil prices now spiking. We're neighboring $80, so good news for Nigeria as far as revenue is concerned, but bad news for us who go to the pump to buy PMS. So I want you to maybe aggregate what is playing out for us here on the program and tell us exactly where you see we stand as a people in terms of policy versus impact.
Geoff, I should let you know that, okay, before I start, I was just going to, talk about the last story, trending story, and about the fact that, look, we're not in a communist state, we're in a democracy. There is a constitution that allows freedom of expression, and the fact that allegedly this is going on, sends a very dangerous signal to Gen Z. And it tells them that in their country, they are not free to express their views. It's going to increase the pressure on the Japa syndrome you've seen because they want to get out of Nigeria to other parts of the world where they are allowed to express themselves. It's very important, that the government realizes that dissent is not an affront on the authority. Dissent creates for healthy debates in a democracy because there are over 200 million Nigerians. And nations are not built by yes men, But back to the issues we're talking about that regards the economy, I was going to tell you that crude oil price is actually back down to $65 per barrel. WTI was trading at 65 yesterday. Brent was trading at about $68 yesterday, which is below the budget benchmark. The budget benchmark, I think, is about between $70 and $75 a barrel. So the temporary reprieve you said that the economy is going to have because crude oil prices are back above oil benchmark, well, is an illusion because, as you can see, the U.S. President Trump has brokered a settlement, at least for now, between Israel and Iran. Is ordered for a ceasefire. And so if we get into the economics of what happened in the Middle East, see, the Middle East produces about 26.6 million barrels of crude oil, down from about 30.4 million barrels of crude oil. The Middle East has installed refining capacity of 12.9 million barrels of crude, but it has capacity utilization of about 10.1 million barrels of crude. So you have countries like Oman, like Bahrain, like Kuwait, Qatar. Qatar left OPEC in 2019. because it wants to focus on gas as a transition fuel. And Qatar is currently the third largest exporter of natural gas, LNG, around the world after the US and Australia. You have the UAE, you have Saudi Arabia. So out of that 16 million barrels, for example, 16 of 26.6 million barrels of crude that is exported on a daily basis, about 13.1 million goes to the Asian tigers, 5.4 million goes to China, 1.1 goes from Iran to China, 2.9 million goes to South Korea, Japan gets about 2.3, India gets about 2.5. So 13.1 million barrels of crude oil from the Middle East goes to Southeast Asia, the Far East. And 2.9 million barrels goes to Europe, Western Europe, and then North America. Saudi Arabia, for example, has a refinery in Texas called Motiva Refinery that has installed capacity of about 54,000 barrels per day. So some of the crude, which is actually mid and light crude, it has API grade of between 31 and 38 degrees, is sent to their refinery in Texas to be able to blend with the heavy crude there, because usually refineries that crude oil that has a higher API degree gives you more transportation fuels, like PMS, like diesel, like jets, and the likes. So you have a situation where if you look at the map of the world, the Middle East, the reason why crude oil prices were going up during the fight between Israel and Iran was because that Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf is between mostly Iran and Qatar, between Turkey and Croatia, which is called the Bosphorus Channel. So when you had 3 years ago the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, the Bosphorus Channel was temporarily closed. Ships from the Black Sea could not come into Europe. So you have the Straits of Hormuz. So the fact that the Iranian parliament at the point approved for the closure of the Straits of Hormuz meant that 16 million barrels of crude oil that should normally on a daily basis go away from the Middle East to the Far East and then to Europe and to North America was threatened, which was the reason why crude oil prices touched $78, $79 a barrel. But the fact that there is a truce means that it's back down. And within this period, we've not seen the Nigerian government, CME, Coordinating Minister of the Economy, come up with a plan, considering that revenue realization has missed by 31%. And the National Assembly has extended the period for capital expenditure for the 2025 Appropriation Act from June to December 2025. So it's a sorry situation. Geoff, I'll tell you what. If you look at the 1.5 million barrels of crude Nigeria produces on a daily basis, cumulatively, I'll tell you it gets about 53.6%, which is equivalent to anywhere around 804,000 barrels of crude on a daily basis. So how is that broken down, and what revenues actually comes to the government, and what is the deficit component in the budget, and what are the challenges the government has? Out of that 804,000, 294,000 is used to pay for sale agreements, which are all the loans that NNPC structured, Project Gazelle, Project Leopard, Project Bison, Project Yield, turnaround maintenance for Port Harcourt, Warri, and Kaduna refineries. I'm sure as time goes on, we'll have time to expatiate on that.
All right.
300,000 barrels is allocated to subsidy. So you have the allocation, production allocation, what NNPC gets on behalf of the Nigerian government. The question I keep asking is, if subsidy is over and if Section 205 of the PIA has been implemented, why is 300,000 barrels of crude oil on a daily basis still allocated to paying subsidy? Is it because it's used to draw down on the $6.8 billion of debt?
All right.
The NNPC claims it was owing to international commodity traders under vendor financing program and DSDP, or is there something else the government has to tell us about where those subsidy savings are going to? Because as we speak, we're in a market-based PMS pricing model, and the government is not paying under recoveries on subsidy. So why is 300,000 barrels of crude allocated for payment of subsidy on a daily basis? 78,000 barrels daily today is allocated to pipeline security. And so if you put that number together, you're coming to be 594 plus 78, somewhere around 672,000 barrels of crude. If you minus it from 804, you arrive at somewhere around 131,000 barrels of crude. That 131,000 barrels is divided between tax oil, which goes to the FIRS, and royalty oil, which is calculated as the cumulative average between price, volume, and depth, by NUPRC. It goes to royalty oil. So if you put that together, you're looking at anywhere around maybe $8.5 million on a daily basis. That actually comes as tax and royalty oil to the government that is not encumbered by all the obligations, subsidy, by forward-sale agreements, crude oil-backed loans.
So many questions in that space, payments. Mr. Emmanuel. And we might also ask, the impact of subsidy savings at the subnational, where is it going to as well? And it's interesting that you have all of these figures off of the top of your head. But earlier, you mentioned the extension of the 2024 budget by the Senate, and that's where I want us to go to. Every budget is supposed to stimulate growth and economic recovery. I'm just wondering, between execution of policy and impact, what do you see in that space? Because The Guardian is reporting this morning that project funding is stalling due to funding. But we see in some spaces that there is no delay of funding. In fact, there's a flurry of execution of projects. So should we be witnessing more than 3.86% of economic growth if the budget 2024 and 25 is being executed in a more disciplined manner, in line with fiscal responsibility?
Bukola, very good question you asked. Listen, if you, for example, multiply the $8.5 million, 131,000 that is due for tax and royalty oil, for example, by 365 days, you arrive at somewhere around $30.1 billion daily. When you do the numbers based on the current exchange rate, you're looking at anywhere less than 5 trillion. That is less than 10% of the total for the 2025 budget. So for me, when I look at the deficit that, in my opinion, has risen to anywhere around 17 or 18%, the debt to GDP ratio, the structure of the budgets, the overhead costs, the personnel costs, the service-wide votes, I don't see fiscal prudence and management. There is an issue with public procurement. There is an issue with the fact that the government doesn't respect the laws that it has in place. And the current Public Procurement Act of 2007 needs to be updated. As a matter of fact, I think that Nigeria should adopt a zero-based budgeting system. People should be able to justify what they're spending money on before they get funded for it. Because you have a situation where there is inflation of EPC costs. And I'll give you an example that doesn't even relate to the budget. I think NNPC is not subject to public procurement, if I'm not mistaken. I'll give you an example with NNPC on NGIC. And this is a point I've always brought up. Nigerian Gas Infrastructure Company, which is the arm of NNPC responsible for building gas infrastructure around Nigeria. On AKK, Abuja, Kaduna, Kano, which is a 614-kilometer pipe, the monies voted for AKK was $2.8 billion. That's over $4 million per kilometer. Around the world, even for export pipeline. Now, Bukola, pay attention that this is actually a domestic pipeline. Even for export pipelines, it doesn't cost more than $1.5 million per kilometer to build a gas transmission pipe. But in Nigeria, NNPC is claiming that it's costing them over $4 million per kilometer to build a gas transmission pipe. That's an example of what I'm saying. Now, let's come back to the budget and come back to the fact that the government is not generating revenues as fast or enough to fund the expenditure estimates or assumptions that is created in the budget. You put up all these fancy numbers of what you're going to spend and how it's going to grow the economy, because when you look at how GDP is calculated, government or public spending plays a part in that calculation. But you're not raising as much revenue. The CME came and said that they generated 6.9 trillion naira from customs, from FIRS, from the oil and gas sector, and ethanol and the likes. But the question is, when you put that 6.9 trillion for the first half, and say, for example, they do another 7 trillion naira in the second half, it's close to 14 trillion. 14 trillion to about 54 trillion. It's still weak. Your revenue to budget is still very weak. Your revenue to GDP, your tax to GDP ratio is still very weak. So for me, the government has an issue with prudence, fiscal responsibility. It has an issue with procurement fraud, inflation of EPC costs. It has an issue with the fact that the size of government is too big. As a matter of fact, I'll say that under President Tinubu, we've had the biggest size of government I've seen. For somebody who comes from Lagos and who is supposed to be close to the private sector, I expected that he will implement the Stephen Orasanye report that has gone through several white paper reviews. What's the point of having such masterful work that was done by Stephen Orasanye if it's not implemented? There are so many government MDAs that are supposed to be merged or that are supposed to be deleted entirely, and they don't have any relevance to the running of the government that serves the people today. There is the inflation of projects and costs. There was back and forth recently between National Assembly and Nigerians on street lights, the cost of street lights, solar street lights, that was inserted in the budget. There are agencies of government and institutes that are funding constituency projects that are not supposed to be. So, for me, I feel like we have the wrong priorities in Nigeria, and we're not ready. I'll say that to you. We're not ready to grow. We're not doing the right things. We don't want to do the right things because there is no incentive to do the right things.
Mr. Manuel, if you can hear me, I'm happy we talked about the budget. I think it's about $38 billion as at the last time I checked in terms of used by 1.5. Cumulatively, as a nation, subnational, FCT, federal government, we're talking in the neighborhood of nothing quite massive to the size of the economy. But as you've said, we have to look at the revenue end before we begin to make a certain kind of projection. If you add the $18 billion to the $36 billion between state and federal government, you see where the numbers are. But revenue is always a challenge for us. The deficit is almost a quarter of our entire budget, which if you cascade it down to the GDP, you can understand what the numbers look like when you're spending between 13 to 15 trillion naira to service debt and all of that. But where I'm going to with all of this is that government has said our fiscal management has looked good in terms of balance of payment, the balance of trade, which of course we know by the J curve simply talks about the deregulation and how it impacts import and export because of the consumption pattern. They've touted excess FX reserve, stability of the market as well. So they pointed a couple of fundamentals that are looking in the right direction. That's apart from the downside ones like the inflation, interest rate, and the ones we are quite familiar with. But when we talk all these numbers and the elites have a conversation, trickle-down economics and the deregulation and all the big grammar, the man on the street is always waiting for, what I perceive is that people are saying, okay, these reforms are necessary and are bold, no problem. But at what point are we going to now start enjoying the impact? That's a question that has been difficult to answer. If you can give us the answer, that would be nice. But again, should Nigerians begin to say, should Nigerians just begin to accept the fact that this is going to be our reality for a very long time? Or how long do they have to wait to either go back close to what they were having before or just forget about it at all? What exactly are you advising ordinary Nigerian who doesn't understand economics?
Geoff, I wish I could give the average person listening, Nigerians at home, wherever they are watching the show, hope that, look, things are going to get better. Of course, leaders are dealers in hope. but I don't see. I can say that on the macro level, there's been an improvement. Where we were today is not where we were in 2023 because the CBN was facing a near technical insolvency. It had all these swaps, it had all these forwards, nearly 20 or even more than $20 billion. The swaps alone were more than $10 billion. The forwards were about $7 billion. They had a negative net external reserve, and they could not defend the Naira in any way. They've migrated from what you had to like a market-based foreign exchange system that has seen increased liquidity. But when you look at not seeing it trickle down to the micro and the nano, which will require a transition period, I'll say the government has done a poor job signaling to Nigerians because of a moral hazard of profligate public behavior with money. The government has not shown Nigerians that it has skin in the game. And if you're telling them to tighten their belt, you should also tighten your belt, because leaders don't lead by talking. They lead by showing example. You know, you don't tell your child that you don't want him to do this when he's saying you do it. You know, example it speaks louder than words, you know. So I think there's a problem of, within that transition period, for the impact of the macro to move to the nano and micro, you're telling Nigerians and holding their hands that things are going to get better and we're with you. And while we're with you, we're also making responsible decisions and we're living by example. I've not seen that from the government, okay? On the subnational level, you see, during the tax debate, there was a strategic and systemic attempt to modify the principles of derivation. Derivation, equity of states, land mass, population, IGR. Personally, I've said this several times. I don't think that Nigeria should share revenues at fact based on the 5 principles that govern the Revenue Mobilization and Fiscal Allocation Commission. I don't think that population, equity of state, and land mass should be metrics by which they share revenue. That's not fiscal federalism. That is what I call politics by compensation and settlement. That's what we're practicing in Nigeria. So we're not ready yet. Okay, but when do these revenues actually is allocated to the states, and when they get it, are they investing in the right things? You know, I would say that the states, for example, they had issues with the fact that the FX revaluation made the external component of their debt to balloon. Also, fair value gains on interest rate revaluation made the bank loans and the state government debts to debt capital markets they were owing to balloon. So their debts ballooned. So a lot of them have used the increase in revenues from FACT to actually service debts. But there is still a lot that they've not shown the people that they are putting in the right places. Okay? Are you putting it in education? Are you putting it in healthcare? Are you investing in community security networks, even if police is not under the concurrent legislative list and still under the exclusive legislative list? And there's still a heated debate on whether police should move from federal to state, which I think it should be, because the current massacre in Benue and several others we've seen is an indication that the police formations from Louis Edet House is ineffective. And for policing to work and for you not to stretch the army, the military that you're currently stretching, because the military is not meant to, you know, do policing work. They're meant to defend Nigeria against external aggression. You need to devolve policing to states and communities. So are the state governments putting the monies they get from the increased allocation to the right areas, education, you know, primary health care, infrastructure, security, community security networks, you know, like set up a state security fund to even fund the federal component of the policing that they don't have sufficient funding for from the federal level? There's no. So you can see the frustration with Nigerians that despite the fact that there's been gains, there's supposed to be subsidy gains from removal of subsidy, like, are not feeling the impact of it in their lives. And I don't blame them for complaining.
Now let's look at, you know, we can't make those points enough, Mr. Emmanuel, but now let's look at the non-oil revenue space with regards to the industries. The National Assembly just increased the target of the Nigeria Customs Service from 6 trillion to 10 trillion. Even at its current target level, we know the impact that this has had on the import space with, price of imported goods skyrocketing. Today, most Nigerians are unable to afford a vehicle with, resort being made increasingly to Nigeria used. What do you believe this increase in target will have on the manufacturing sector?
Bukola, I sympathize with the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. I've been privileged to be in close complaint firsthand. I speak to CEOs, and I hear them complain about the difficulties of doing business in Nigeria, even if you have a Presidential Ease of Doing Business Council, and Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment is doing some work in that regards. But Bukola, I'll tell you what. So I believe that the final draft of the passed bill that is now been sent to the President for accent has not come out yet. So we don't know if the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reform, for example, did fantastic work. Committee led by example, did fantastically well with it. If Customs was subsumed into the Nigerian Revenue Service, and it means that when the President assigns it, Customs will no longer be in charge of collecting. I don't know if that's scaled through the National Assembly. I don't know if that was struck down. But I was of the fierce view that Customs should not be responsible for collecting revenues on behalf of the government. Customs should be responsible for trade facilitation and border security. And I also am of the view that immigration should be merged with Customs, to form one major agency. Look, Bukola, the increasing their targets revenues. Number one, there is the issue of under-declaration of consignment, of the value of cargoes. It's a very popular practice. If you speak to practitioners in the sector, if you speak to the Nigerian Customs, they will tell you. There's an under-declaration of consignment, which means that the government is cheated of revenues, import duties, and all of those calculations. I also saw that National Assembly has asked that CISS levy for ECOWAS be removed from the formula for calculating duties paid at the ports in Nigeria. So, for example, I think the price verification system that the central bank had introduced under the former governor, Emefiele, was a masterstroke, but it has real issues implementing because the system was not properly designed. So instead of being a solution, it became like a drag on the whole system. And it was eventually voted and removed from the system. But the CBN has to work with Customs to come back with that price verification system to benchmark consignments and ensure that the correct duties are paid. That's number one. Number two, there is too much focus on the Western Maritime Corridor. There's too much focus on port operations in the Western flank. Snake Island, I think Niger Dock is building a port in Snake Island. AP Mola plans to build a port in Badagry because the channel draft in Apapa is 10 meters, even if Nigerian Port Authority claims the channel draft is 13 meters. Yeah. You have all these port operations in the Western flank, not enough activity in the Eastern flank. There means that the duties that are paid for bringing in cargoes to Onair is more expensive, which makes it not as competitive as Lagos. Lagos, Apapa, for example, is a river port. And I'll tell you why, this thing has to be, they need to pay attention to it as a way to, increase trade and commerce in the Eastern Corridor and improve the revenues generated by customs at borders. Okay? Listen, Akwa Ibom has the highest channel draft in Nigeria, about 16 meters. It has the shortest shore to sea in Nigeria, about 16 kilometers. No other state in Nigeria, littoral state, of the 8 littoral states that borders on the Atlantic Ocean, has a shore to sea like Akwa Ibom. So you have a situation where Lagos is choked, all this commerce is coming to Lagos, but if you open up the Eastern Maritime Corridor, which also is the opening and access from the Congo River down into West Africa, into like the priority river roads that was designed in 2002, 10 priority river roads that were supposed to
Kelvin,
house 10 inland ports. You open up trade and activity in the Eastern Corridor and you improve revenues. So the solution is not for the Senate to ask customs to raise the revenues they collect and they become more aggressive at the ports with people bringing in goods. The solution is to diversify maritime operations.
All right, Gavin, if I may come in because of time, I think that point you just landed on is a very great point. Diversification over concentration on these Lagos ports. I don't know what's going on. There are several other ports that could be developed to spread out some of the things that are coming in and leaving our country. But because of time, we'll just have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Kelvin Emmanuel, for your insight and the way you throw data and numbers. It's always a delight to watch. Most of the time, I don't know how you commit these numbers to your memory, but it just the way you play with this data is quite interesting and fantastic to see. Thank you so much for coming on the program. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Joe.
Appreciate it. Okay, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be talking with Senator Shehu Sani, who represented Kaduna Central in the Senate, and he will be talking to us about politics. This time we're focusing exclusively about politics of the APC, opposition, and 2027. Join us in just a moment. We'll be right back.